Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing our series on Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies with our final read, which will be Chapter 8, Parting Thoughts. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, so I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, at the end of each read, we will be doing an analysis and review of the read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to that, so you can jump straight to the analysis and review part of the video if that's how you'd like to go about things. So without further ado, let's dive on into tonight's read, which is Chapter 8, Parting Thoughts. Many individual fallacies are part of a larger pattern. These larger patterns include not only the fallacies mentioned in Chapter 1, the zero-sum fallacy, the fallacy of composition, the chess piece fallacy, and the open-ended fallacy, but also many forms of the fallacy of implicitly assuming sameness when there is no reason to expect sameness. Differences in geography, demography, history, and culture are just some of the differences among individuals, groups, and nations. There is no reason to expect women and men to work the same number of hours, nor any reason why they should. There is no reason to assume that the goals, priorities, or abilities of high school dropouts are the same as those of college graduates, so that differences in their incomes can be attributed to college. There's no reason to expect third world economies to respond to foreign aid the way that Europe responded to the Marshall Plan, when these economies and societies have been vastly different from those in Europe for centuries. Throughout history, the world has abounded with differences that are today called quote-unquote disparities or quote-unquote inequities, even in situations where they cannot be explained by discrimination. At one time, in Tsarist Russia, nearly all of the members of the St. Petersburg Academy of Sciences were of German ancestry, even though people of German ancestry were only about 1% of the population of Russia. Today, more than 40% of all the billionaires in the world are in one country, the United States. The list could go on until it filled a book. But however common such statistical disparities have been around the world and throughout history, many continue to reason as if any statistical differences between any groups are strange and suspicious, if not sinister. Another fallacy already noted in chapters 5 and 7 is what might be called the fallacy of changing composition. When statistical categories are compared over time, the changing relationships among these categories can be completely misleading as to what is happening to the people or the nations within those categories when the composition of these categories is changing over time. There may be growing inequalities between those categories during the very same span of years when there is a lessening of inequality between the people or nations who constitute those categories. Moreover, important conclusions and decisions can be based on this fallacy. For example, the growth of international free trade has been said to increase inequality among nations because the 23-to-1 ratio between the 20 richest and 20 poorest nations in 1960 rose to a 36-to-1 ratio in 2000. But the nations constituting the 20 richest and 20 poorest were different in 1960 and 2000. Comparing the same 20 richest and 20 poorest nations of 1960 over those decades shows that the ratio between the richest and poorest declined to less than 10 to 1. This leads to the directly opposite conclusion, suggesting that freer international trade may have helped reduce inequality among nations, allowing some of the initially poorest to rise out of the category of the bottom 20. Whatever the reason for the declining inequality, the fallacy of believing that international inequality had increased when it in fact had decreased is similar to an old joke about automobile accidents in Manhattan. In this joke, One friend says to another that statistics show that a man is hit by a car in Manhattan once every 20 minutes, to which the other replies, quote, "He must get awfully tired of that," end quote. The fallacy here is that it is obviously not the same man each time. The very same fallacy underlies much more serious conclusions about both personal and international inequalities over time, when it is not the same individuals or the same nations that are being compared, since each moves from one category to another over time. The changing composition of the categories makes conclusions based on comparisons between the categories fallacious. Statistics are no better than the methods and definitions used in collecting them. Without scrutinizing these methods and definitions, we cannot assume that comparable people are being compared, whether comparing the incomes of high school dropouts with college graduates, the incomes of members of different ethnic groups who have the quote-unquote same education, or the incomes of single women with married women, when quote-unquote single women includes women who were married for years before getting divorced. Nor can statistics about the amount of air pollution in populated areas versus open space tell us anything about whether letting people move into unpopulated areas will increase the total pollution overall, since it is people, not their locations, that generate pollution. Perhaps the most dangerous of all is the practice of not subjecting fashionable beliefs to the test of facts, but instead accepting or rejecting beliefs according to how well they fit some pre-existing vision of the world. The idea that government intervention is needed to create quote-unquote affordable housing is an idea that makes sense only in the context of a preconceived notion, while mountains of hard evidence point to the exact opposite direction. The belief that ghetto riots, such as those of the 1960s, are a reaction against poverty, discrimination, unemployment, and blighted communities simply will not stand up in the face of hard evidence of when and where those riots took place, which were not in the places or times where these factors were worse. The entire educational and employment history of women in the first half of the 20th century is almost invariably ignored, even in scholarly studies, to concentrate attention on what happened since 1960, which can be made to fit a preconceived vision of the reasons for women's rise. Similarly with blacks, whose rise out of poverty and into middle class occupations are likewise traced almost invariably from the same point after 1960 and attributed to the civil rights movement and government actions of that decade, even though the most dramatic rises of blacks out of poverty occurred in the 2 decades before 1960. Nothing is more fallacious than to ignore a trend that began years before some policy or action that is credited with whatever happened as a continuation of a pre-existing trend. Similar fallacies have appeared in discussions of things ranging from automobile fatality rates to market shares of companies after an antitrust lawsuit. Among the many preconceptions that cannot be subjected to any empirical tests because they are so subjective is the notion that third-party observers know better what is good for people than those people know themselves. This implicit assumption pervades discussion of urban and suburban housing, mass transit versus automobiles, and the imposition of international aid agencies' pet theories on third-world countries. The most that can be done in these cases is to 1. Make that implicit assumption explicit, 2. Demand proof of that superior knowledge, and 3. Point out how many disasters in countries around the world have followed in the wake of programs and policies based on that assumption. A special variant of the implicit assumption of vastly superior knowledge is the sweeping dismissal of first-hand observations of other people as quote-unquote stereotypes, such as dismissals often being based on little or no first-hand observation by those who dismiss, but based instead on assumptions widely shared by similarly inexperienced and presumptuous people, often insulated against criticisms or facts by academic degrees. Tautologies are another source of fallacies and a major source of their defense. Quote-unquote overpopulation, for example, can be defined in such a way that a high ratio of people to wealth is said to explain poverty when all that it does in reality is demonstrate the rules of arithmetic rather than any fact about the real world. But until people realize that they are talking in a circle, however large that circle may be, they may continue to believe insinuations that give tautologies their power, as if they were conclusions about the external world instead of arbitrary definitions inside their own heads. Tautologies about population are just one of a much larger number of notions, whose lack of clarity and concreteness is their greatest asset in convincing people without either evidence or logic. As philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce said back in the 19th century, quote, "Many a man has cherished for years as his hobby some vague shadow of an idea too meaningless to be positively false." End quote. The particular fallacies discussed in this book are only a small sample of a vastly larger number on a vastly wider variety of subjects. If seeing how these often plausible-sounding fallacies can collapse under the weight of evidence and analysis causes you to examine other beliefs more closely and more analytically, then this book will have achieved its larger purpose. All right, that concludes tonight's read, and it concludes the book. So we'll jump in now to a very short analysis and review. All right, welcome to the final analysis and review part of the video for this series. And as the final read was itself short and kind of redundant, we're going to have this review be fairly short as well. So, I mean, the lesson to be gleaned from this final chapter is simply abide by the scientific method. I think that seems to be his lesson throughout the book. Just the scientific method is there for a reason. Abide by it. And that's really all there is to take from this chapter, because he's already gone over all of the things that he mentioned throughout the course of this chapter in the previous reads, which you guys have hopefully followed along with to this point. And you guys have hopefully checked into the analysis and review part of the videos if you had any confusion or if you had any questions. And, feel free to comment on any of those videos too if you have any questions or if you have any disagreements with Sowell. I did do a review of this book, so if you want to get a proper review of the whole book as part of this analysis and review, I'll put a link in this video's description to that review, so you can go ahead and jump to that review. And on that note, now that I've read the book a second time, I may have to do a re-review, where not only would I review my review, but I have to give a second review of the book, because to be honest, after a second reading of this book, it's actually gotten better in my opinion. It got better with the second read through. I personally love and have grown to love even more the debunking of myths and fallacies with facts and logic, not to sound too much like a Ben Shapiro meme here, but the book was just nonstop that. So I would expect that whatever my review was previously, it's probably going to be even more glowing the second time around. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. So go ahead and put in the comments section what you thought now that we've finished with this read. And I should be wrapping up Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson in just a few reads, so you guys can follow along there as well. We'll be able to get through that a little quicker now that we won't have another book to be going along with that. So since we're going to be wrapping things up in both books fairly soon here, I'd love to know what you guys would like me to read next and what you'd like me to go over next. So go ahead and put that in the comment section as well. And with all that done and with all that out of the way, I hope you guys all enjoyed as much as I did, and we'll see you in the next one. Good night, folks.